Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, author Michael Livingston and his book, Agincourt. You know how you'll have a whole bunch of books that you need to read, and then all of a sudden, this book pops up and you're like, this is going to the front of the line? Mike's book on Agincourt was one of those for me. Everything about it said, I need to read this right now. I'm so excited that I did. I actually recorded this with him a couple of months ago, but Mike just seems to never stop writing. In between interviewing him for that book and this coming out, he also published another book with author Mike Cole on a bunch of the battles of Thermopylae called The Killing Ground. So once you hear Mike today, you're going to have to buy 2 books. That's what I'm just trying to tell you. So I'm not going to belabor the point anymore. This is so much fun. Let's get to it. And here we are with author Michael Livingston, Agincourt, Battle of the Scarred King. Mike, thank you so much for coming on.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Mike, I got to ask a question because, and this seems to happen a lot. You got a professor at the Citadel, Secretary General of the U.S. Commission on Military History, co-host of the Bow and Blade podcast, and then the author of various books. Have you decided to not sleep anymore? How are you getting this all done?
So, it's interesting. If you write one book with your left hand and one with your right hand, like you do it twice as fast. So I found that works really well. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, the other thing, too, is you're not just a history writer. Like, you're doing fantasy, you're doing a little bit of everything all over. Are you the type of brain that, like, you could be writing a history book and then, hey, I'm going to go do a chapter on my fantasy novel? Or do you have to do one at a time?
I actually write them concurrently. So I don't know if this would work for anybody else. But for me, if I'm writing multiple projects, I sort of never have to stop, right? If I don't know what I'm going to do for the next bit on Agincourt, my brain has meanwhile figured out the next bit to do on this other project, right? So I switch to that, do that for a little bit. And if I get stuck, that's what I'm going to do on Agincourt. And then I can go back. So yeah, I'm usually writing, 3 or 4 things kind of simultaneously, different stages of processing. And the only trouble, that I run into is timing deadlines, right? Because the publisher is like, I need this book by this date. You have to kind of at some point, this one has got to be, full tilt to get it done. But at least thus far, I've never screwed that up. So
let's go to it. Agincourt. Listen, there's probably some Shakespeare fans that might read this and get pretty angry with you, right? Like they've got a picture in their head of how this goes down. What made you decide I'm writing this book? This
is a book that I never thought I would write. I first went to Agincourt quite some time ago with a theory about a specific tactical thing that I thought was taking place. And with 2 of my good friends and colleagues, Kelly DeVries and Bob Wisdom Savage. Shout out to Bob and Kelly. We visited Agincourt. I had this idea. Like 5 minutes into it, I was like, that idea doesn't work and it's stupid. But what I was seeing on the field was like, this doesn't really add up. I mean, the story that I'm being told doesn't quite work here. I'm not totally sure why. But on that same trip, Crécy is just down the road from Agincourt. So we went to the battle site of Crécy, and there it was like, this really doesn't make sense. This thing that cannot be here. Something is seriously wrong. And so I ended up kind of taking on the case of figuring out the Battle of Crécy. And that was, years of doing that. And the kind of previous book that I did for Osprey was Crécy, Battle of 5 Kings, which basically lays out that and why that was, probably did not take place where everybody thought it did and so forth. While I was engaged in that process, a amazing conflict archaeologist, best conflict archaeologist in the world, basically, Tim Sutherland, came out with a couple of articles in which he said, Agincourt might not be where we think it is. Something's not right because I've done all these surveys and archaeological work and there's like 0 evidence of this battle and there should be a lot. And he had suggested, one suggested it needs to move north, another one that needs to move south. And, I kept expecting somebody's going to take the chance on this, right? Somebody's going to open the case and look, and nobody did. Just nobody did. And so I was wrapping up Crécy and I was like, well, if nobody else is going to take a look at this thing, let me take a look. As soon as I started doing that, it started kind of adding together that the story that I was told, and that most of us kind of understood had some serious holes in it. That's never the intention of a project like this. I think a lot of people think that I sort of like am walking around trying to figure out a table to throw over. That's not the case. What you're doing is just trying to figure out what happened, in history. And sometimes, as in this case, and in the case of Crecy, what you end up finding is that things don't fit right. And those kind of get more attention because it's no fun to publish something that says, I looked at this case and what everybody said is right. I mean, that's nothing, you publish as an article. That doesn't make any sense. Dear everyone, you're right. Who cares? The only reason to worry about publishing is you found something different. So yeah, it was not something I planned to do, but I'm glad I did do it because it is I think it's a good book, and I hopefully my arguments make sense about what happened there.
And I don't want to go over them because I do want people to read it. But I mean, one of them, I wrote about it in my review. So if anybody reads my review, I'm not going to go into it, but there's a castle, and like that argument just makes perfect sense of this place can't be where we think it is. But just jumping back a little bit, is it exciting for you when you see that? Like you said, you're not out looking to argue with people, but is there kind of a push and pull of, hey, I see something new, but then again, right, and you talk about this. There's excellent historians who have done this work before, and you're in effect going to argue with them. Is there a little bit of apprehension as well to kind of sit there and say, hey, I think these people who are very revered might be wrong about this?
Yeah. When I'm on these fields, I'm arguing with myself, and I'm really trying to figure out a way that they're right and I'm wrong, right? My assumption is not, they're wrong. My assumption is, what's the matter with me that I don't understand it, right? That what they're saying doesn't make any, surely they could see this. It's so obvious. Like, I mean, they mentioned the case of this castle. It's like, what are you going to ignore this? Like, how can you ignore this? It's on the field. How can you ignore this? It's got to be. So what is wrong with me? Like, and I really am very wary of the idea that I'm right. I really am spending my time trying to kind of like browbeat myself into being in line with everybody else. And it's only on the back end of that where you're like, no, I cannot figure out any way to be wrong, that you then feel comfortable. I mean, as comfortable as one can feel. 1,000 books have come out on Agincourt, however many there are. And yeah, I think they're all wrong. That's a very disturbing position to be in, but it's also, kind of like, what am I going to do? These are the facts. That's how they lay out. It's not my fault. Let me just write it up. And so, yeah, it is something you kind of worry about, but you can't worry about it in terms of anything other than, have I done my due diligence to figure out the case? And in that respect, I think it's probably like, a detective or whatever, right? You try not to make assumptions and, assume guilt or innocence or anything like that. You're just trying to gather facts, right? And make sense of them entire. And once all that fits together, then you start feeling comfortable. But until then, you want to make sure there's nothing you missed.
Now, obviously, it's a great book. I love it. That's why you're on here. However, if it was just you walking around a field and saying, I don't think it was here, it might not be very attention grabbing. But you go back and you kind of start with, what do we think of Agincourt when we talk about it? Somebody who has not been through like the real history of it is going to think about Shakespeare and Once More Into the Breach, all of those things.
Yeah.
I think the truth is cooler because it's called Battle of the Scarred King because, well, he took an arrow to the face earlier in his life, right? It's the gnarliest thing I've ever heard. Can you tell me a little bit more?
Yeah. So Henry V, and look, you're right. I mean, Shakespeare, God, the dude is pretty good. He's a pretty good writer, comes up with some good stuff.
I think he's got a future. I do. I really think he has a future.
Yeah, he's going places, Bill. He's going places. And there's nothing wrong with the story he's telling. I mean, but it's a story. It's not history. He actually has this kind of hinted at, and I talk about this in the book, the Battle of Shrewsbury, which features in Shakespeare's plays in a very elaborate and kind of not real fashion. He actually has this reference to Prince Hal, the future Henry V, 16 years old at that point at the Battle of Shrewsbury, getting a shallow scratch. When in fact we have the doctor's report and everything. It was 6 inches deep. He took an arrow 6 inches deep into his face. And the doctor manages to extract the arrowhead. The problem is they pulled the arrow and the arrowhead was left behind in his skull. And they had to get it out. And yeah, John Bradmore, a physician, comes up to the castle and actually manages to extract this and then writes about it. And we have the report. And it's a hell of a thing to read. I mean, my goodness.
It's one of the coolest things medically I've read in like an old-timey book was this doctor figuring out how to pull an arrowhead out of someone's face and doing it successfully.
And doing it successfully, yeah. And the first time I kind of came across it, I was like, why doesn't nobody talk about this, man? This is wild. It's horrific too, but it's absolutely wild. And I had written an article trying to figure out where the arrow went through, because there were lots of sort of like, oh, he was hit in the cheek and things like this. And I was like, that doesn't match the doctor's report because he doesn't talk about bone damage or anything. So I kind of came up with a theory about how it would work. And then I had some, neuroscientists and stuff talking about, yeah, this would work. And, here's diagrams of it and things from the medical perspective. Yeah, it's an awfully amazing story. And one of the reasons I start the book with it, I kind of have two beginnings, that being the English side, is that I think it's important to know King Henry V does not sort of, appear out of nothingness on the Agincourt campaign. He's got quite a history before this point. And to have gone through what he did at the age of 16, taking this arrow to the face, any little deviation would have killed him. And the agony he had gone through, both with the injury and with the removal of this arrowhead, that will scar you. It will scar you physically, but I think also mentally, right? I think he is somebody who suffered trauma, and people respond to that in different ways. Obviously, I cannot diagnose the man, but I think if we try to tell a story about his actions on the field without a sharp awareness that he had gone through something like this, I feel like we're missing part of the pictures. So yeah, that's why it's the Battle of the Scarred King. I think it affected him for sure.
Something else I really love about the book is you really kind of just make the point that, hey, by the way, there's the 100 Years' War. We don't have time to go through all of that. And I mean, personally, for me, I appreciate it is that you're able to just say, hey, listen, I can't go through everything. I'm going to give you the cool stuff, and then we're going to talk about the stuff that I've figured out. You almost write almost kind of in a familiar fashion, like you're having a conversation with people. Is that just how you write? Is that a choice you make for the book? Because, I mean, a lot of people get turned off when they hear military history because, honestly, bad military history can be boring as hell. But, I mean, really good military history tells a story, and you feel part of it.
Yeah, I mean, it is very much an intentional choice. I write novels. All these things are telling a story, and I don't view it as any different. Whether I'm telling a history or I'm telling a fantasy novel, whatever, there's a beginning, a middle, end. I need to hook the reader. I need to keep you reading. I got to think about pace. I got to think about all this stuff, and tone is a big part of that. As you say, history in general can be awfully boring if you don't. I mean, the history isn't boring, but people can tell it very dry, and you're like, come on, man, this is amazing stuff. So yeah, I try to write, something like the way I teach, if we were, instead of, sitting in our offices, we were at the bar, and this is basically me. This is how I am, so I definitely try and write that way and try and be like inviting to the reader who may not know anything about history. And as you say, this isn't a book that's going to give you, the full history of the 100 Years' War, because you don't need all of it, but you need this piece and you need this piece. So here you go. And I'll tell those as interestingly as I can so that you are ready for the show that I'm about to give you.
I mean, we talked about how cool the English side is, because again, arrow to the face, it's hard not to be interesting with that, but the French side too, which is very often ignored in this story, right? Henry V becomes the story. But here you talk about the French side has just as much kind of crazy things going on, and I use crazy very specifically. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about what's going on the French side before we end up at Agincourt?
The biggest thing is that their king is crazy, and not just metaphorically. He's nuts. I actually tell the story. That's sort of the French beginning of the story to me is what happens that he kind of goes bonkers. And that's necessary because there's this impression that people think, Henry V defeated France. Not really. He defeated like part of France because they're basically in the middle of a civil war. It's a bit like you're fighting somebody with one hand tied behind their back. I mean, it's impressive you won the fight, but they had a hand tied behind their back. We should take note of that. And that certainly is the case with France at this point. I do think Henry should be, from the English perspective, lauded for that awareness, right? This is a good time to do something because they are in this weak position, and he knows that. Generally speaking, the French in Agincourt have been regarded as simply a cardboard cutout waiting to be dropped. Like nobody seemed to care about their motivations or, what they were thinking on the day, right? Any of that stuff. It's always just, rah, rah, England. I'm by no means trying to sort of write the French history of Agincourt, but it's the history of the battle. That's both sides. And so we have to treat them sort of equally and, with an equal opportunity toward, what they were up to. I do think in that regard, there's some utility to the fact that I'm an American. As I say to people, I don't have a dog in this fight. It's nothing to me. It's just what happened. And I get attacked for that by some people. How dare this Yankee come along and mess with our history? And I'm like, well, actually, I'm a really good person to look at that stuff because, I'm not bringing any biases to bear. But I do know that it rubs some people the wrong way.
Now, especially, right, you're a historian, even where the battlefield, that's important to you. I have to think, reading a lot of history, trying, not to diagnose mental health problems, especially in kings back in the day, that's got to be hard for somebody who's a historian because, you want to be able to say, like, this is what was afflicting them. But B, if you're a historian, what you're dealing with when somebody's writing about a sick king, you're never going to get the full truth. You're never going to get the actual list of what's actually wrong. Does that drive you just as crazy as if you're looking at a battlefield and you're like, I can't tell what this is?
It does, but I guess I'm more accustomed to, the fact that we're dealing with psychologies and we can't know everything about them. I mean, that's sort of baked in from the beginning. It drives me more bonkers being on the field and not being able to make it work. That really frustrates my mind. It just really bothers because, so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, they all wrote about this. And how could they have it differently? How can they see this happening the way they keep saying? That doesn't make sense of the dimensions of this space or the topography or whatever. And so that feels much more in friction because you feel like there is an answer and it is accessible. Why is the answer coming up so differently? You wish you knew, right? I wish I knew for certain what's going on, as you say, kind of like diagnosably with the King of France. I mean, historians have tried to basically diagnose what it is, but we can't know, right? You can't exactly sit there with the DSM, whatever we're up to now, the DSM-7 or whatever it is now, and diagnose, at least not in a fully reasonable way to be able to use it for anything. You could do it kind of just to do it, but you wouldn't want to rely on it too much. And I'm aware saying that I diagnosed Frodo Baggins in an article once. So, again, you can kind of you could do it, but, what do you do with that is the question. I think, Frodo Baggins has diagnosably got PTSD. And what's important to me about that is what that says about Tolkien and that kind of thing. But yeah, what you can do with knowing for certain what is ailing the King of France, I think is fairly limited. But it is important for us to know that the dude's not right in the head. His biggest problem, the kingdom's biggest problem, is that he's in and out of lucidity. There'll be times when he is there and he's just the dude. And then other times he's not there, right? And so that on and off, that's worse than if he was just gone, right? If he's gone, then you kind of establish a regency. There's a plan of attack for that. But there's not really a good plan of attack in medieval kingship if the king is kind of a light switch going on and off as far as his lucidity. And that's really what's causing the friction and as I said, a near civil war in France at the time.
And it's something really simple that I think people, and I know I wasn't thinking about it as you're reading it, because, you've talked about finding the battlefield and all that stuff. You start talking about this battle, huge battle, all of these things going on, and everybody really needs to read it. But you talk about it later on that, you have this gigantic battle, which means if you went out there with a metal detector right now, if there's a huge battle, even from hundreds of years ago, you're probably going to find something, right? Because at other battlefields just like this, you will. It's like there's a hilt here, there's something. Whereas where we say Agincourt is, there doesn't seem to be much of anything in the, let's just say, the accepted before your book location, right?
Yeah, there should be thousands of artifacts. That's what we would anticipate. And that's the reason it's so strange that there's nothing there. And Tim Sutherland, again, credit to him, was quite right to point that out and be like, look, something's not adding up because there should be so much, especially the way Agincourt goes, what we know kind of happened afterwards. There should be so much stuff there. All the arrowheads, there should be thousands of arrowheads and buckles. There should be so many buckles because the gathering of armor, you don't undress a body. That's not what you do. People say, oh, they stripped the corpses. And that's the reason nothing's there. Like, no. If they were stripping the corpses, what they're doing is they're cutting things off, and they cut buckles. So all these buckles and attachments that are holding the armor together, they're just cutting all those leather straps. So there's buckles going everywhere. So one of the things we should absolutely be expecting to find is a bunch of bloody buckles. And again, all these arrowheads, in addition to broken bits of weaponry and spurs and things like that. We're not finding anything. Sutherland has this great line in one of the articles. I think it was the one that came out in 2016. He says, there is currently no evidence of the Battle of Agincourt having ever occurred. And it's like, obviously the battle happened. We all know that, but it's a great way of sort of pointing out there's zero evidence of this, and we should be swimming in evidence. And that's just a problem. So, what do we do with it? And, look, it could be if everything matched up and, there was no reason to doubt the location. Well, we'd have to find some way to explain the missing artifacts. We could figure something out. The problem is that, again, when I kind of opened the case up, nothing else is adding up either, right? So you have, the missing artifacts. That's sort of one potential clue, and then the sources are all telling us that this doesn't seem in the right spot, and this and this and this, and pretty soon it's like, well, maybe the battle needs to be moved. Not a lot. I didn't sort of move it to Germany or something like that, but I did move the battlefield a little bit.
That would be a heck of a book. Moving to a completely different country. I'd love to see how you move that one. And also the way you explain the battle too, I really appreciate it because, again, I'm former military, so I have some background in this stuff, but it all becomes very clear and you can actually kind of see what's going on. Listen, I could talk about the details of the actual battle for hours with you, but what I came back to at the end of it was Henry V lucky, good, or both?
I think any battle of this scale, luck is part of it. I mean, anything can go wrong at any given point. That's battle, fighting, period, right? Best laid plans of mice and men kind of thing. He was extraordinarily lucky in what the French did and did not do that day. Extraordinarily lucky. But he was also very good in that the things he could control, he did right. So, from the position that I believe he took to the tactics he's using, his ability to command and control on the battlefield. Command and control is a huge thing. It doesn't get talked about enough because I think not enough people have kind of military, knowledge to understand that kind of thing. But command and control is massive, and he maintains it in the face of extraordinary odds. As a leader, the dude nails it that day. On the one hand, gosh, what an amazing job. But he's not in a vacuum, right? The French are there too, and what they're doing matters. And they make some egregious errors, and those play into the fact that this battle goes so incredibly one way, when by all rights, it should not have. I mean, if the French don't make the mistakes that they make, they win this battle. Despite how well Henry had set things up. This is not a battle he should win, much less the enormity of the victory he has, because it is absolutely enormous and completely one-sided. It shouldn't have been that way, but it was. And, it takes two to tango, and he did good, they did bad. Well, that's what happens, So, I try to stage through so that readers can understand the tactics involved on the day, in addition to kind of like the, pre-battle strategies of what's going on, but the on-the-ground tactics, to really help people kind of see that and understand why the French did what they did and why Henry did what they did. Because, nobody here was acting foolishly. They were, had very specific sets of goals in mind, and it's worth it. And I think kind of respectful of their lives and deaths on the French side, especially, to try and understand those.
It's one of kind of your precepts that you have in here that I really appreciate. It makes you think of it is that no one's trying to do a bad job. Nobody is intentionally making bad decisions. You have to sit there and say, why did somebody do this? They're going to do this for a reason that they think will work. And not to just assume, the French did something stupid because the French are stupid. Yeah,
it's a precept I have I have a number of these in my books that I talk about. No man is a fool. And yeah, that's exactly right. There's this idea. I mean, I've had colleagues, I won't say who, but, say this in discussions, where I'll say, well, why do you think the French would do this? Doesn't that make sense? Well, French are stupid. Are you kidding? Really? That's the hill you're going to die on? It's just the French are stupid? Do you not hear yourself? But I think it was kind of easy for a lot of people to think that way. I mean, you thought, well, they lost, so they screwed up. But no, they're not stupid. They had, as you said, a plan. It might be in retrospect a horrible plan. Right? You could be like, that was not a good thing. Oh my God, you screwed that up. But of course the question is, rightly should be asked, why did you screw that up? Right? Was it a failure of reconnaissance? Was it a failure of communications? Was it, an overweening pride? Was it, this, that? If you're not kind of asking that secondary and tertiary question, you've, I think, truly failed to understand what's happening. You're instead kind of writing polemic at that point. And I think we kind of should try to avoid that in whatever we're doing as historians. I mean, if not as human beings, to try and think through, what is the other side up to, as critically as possible. And I hope, that those people with, military experience, such as yourself, do kind of appreciate that, and see that kind of hews closer, I think, to reality than anything, just saying, oh, well, these people are idiots. Because, in battle, if your plans are predicated on the enemy being stupid, you're probably going to die. You're not going to survive that fight.
It's going to be a bad day.
Yeah, it's going to be a bad day. For sure. You're going to be stuck on the X, and you don't want to be on the X. If you think they're stupid, you're going to be on the X. Get off the X and stop thinking they're dumb. It's something that's important to me, to try and kind of share that with people. And again, do it in a way that is approachable. Just we're sitting at a bar, chatting.
I got a time machine. I'm sending you back in time. You get to talk to anyone from your book, right? They have to tell you the truth. And if you choose the King of France, I'm going to promise you that he's lucid for the entire interview. You can only pick one.
Yeah.
You can only pick one. Who'd it be?
Oh, it'd have to be Henry. I mean, the King of France isn't there, so that's no good. It'd have to be Henry. And the questions I would have for him, if I could ask him questions, would be mostly along the lines of, how did you maintain command and control and morale? In the book, I kind of go through, everything that happened since he had landed in France. Because I think it's important to understand what happens on the day of the battle is what, these men had gone through. And when you really kind of go through all that, Henry had made, I think, an egregious error in trying to do the march he was trying to do. I have colleagues who think he did this to go fight the French. No, man, not at all. He gets caught, and that's why he has to fight a battle. And it's a terrible position he's in. He does the best he can at that point and does it very well, but it was not a good thing. And I would love to ask, Henry, what were you thinking, man? How did you think you could do this march that you were planning to do? Did you think the French were stupid? Did you think that? Because they weren't, were they? And I'd just love to know, he had to be conscious of the morale of his men and trying to keep that up. But we truly don't know. How did he do that? There's later stories, right? The story of him being in disguise among his men and all that kind of stuff the night before the battle. I doubt it very much, but I would really love to know, how conscious were you of the need to maintain command and control? How did you do that, right? How did you actually do it on the field? Because those are questions that the sources do not give us. I can put together the major tactics, the major moves, but you can't access that through what we have. And that's where, in the end, the rubber hits the road. Is that in the moment, how did you get these people to do what they did? God, I'd love that answer. I would love that.
Well, I need an answer for this last question, right? Now, you teach history, so you know this. There are people who are like, I have to take history because it's a class in high school or college that I'm being forced to take. I don't want to read a book on history in my off time, right? I get one of those people, I sit them in front of you and they said, why should I read your book, Agincourt? What would you say?
I would mainly say, you don't have to. This is part of, I think, the problem that we have, with this kind of, I think it's good, right, that we expect people to be as well-read, read across this stuff. But the have to does get in our way. You don't have to read this, but, hey, look, this is a pretty cool story. This is a story of this guy who's really made some major mistakes, comes to this battle. He's outnumbered, right? He's cornered. He's got dysentery. Half the guys are pooping themselves, as they're getting ready to fight. He's low on ammo. He's low on all this stuff, and he wins this battle. Wouldn't you like to know how that happened, right? How that transpired? But, in the end, does this draw you? Does it not? Yeah. I mean, hopefully if you kind of are open to reality, you're going to be interested in these things, right? I think people would enjoy reading Beowulf if they just were free to read Beowulf. It's a cool story, it's not because it's an assignment, because Beowulf's cool. This is an amazing story. You should just read this. This guy goes and fights a dragon at the age of 80. Come on. That's something else, isn't it? And he's like, no, I got this. Give me I'm put my fighting teeth in. I'm going in. That's a cool dude. I want to hear about that guy. I think medieval stuff is fun. Obviously, I'm a medievalist, so I think battles are fun. I mean, not fun. I mean, like, obviously battles are bad, but fun to learn about.
Yeah, fun to read about when you're not in them.
Right, when you're not in them, and from the safety of several centuries. And, you know, I mean, wouldn't we all like to know what it is that people are talking about with Agincourt? You know, I mean, it's a battle that comes up a lot. Band of brothers, once more into the breach, you know, all that jazz. Wouldn't you like to know what all that's about? Read my book. And hopefully it's a good book.
Absolutely. I loved it. Mike, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's it for this episode. Mike, thank you so much for coming on. Agincourt, The Killing Ground, his podcast, Bow and Blade. Mike has probably written another book by the time this episode is finished. Who knows? But anyway, go out and get them. Listen to the podcast. For us, hit us up Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Don't forget, we have a YouTube channel now. Check that one out as well. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.